Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Shendor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lorraine in Texas, Paul in the Great Northwest, Nancy in North Carolina, Marjorie in Georgia, Franco in rainy Trieste, Italy. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our own Yehudit Sobel in memory of my dear father's 26th yahrzeit. Her father's name was Dr. Matthias Sobel, Moshe Avigdor HaKohen. He was born during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. He grew up and worked in communism. But he wore his Judaism on his sleeve, never wavering, despite living in an era when being openly Jewish had serious consequences. He was a great example for Jews then and now. What a beautiful tribute to your dad, Yehudit. May his memory always be for a blessing. May his neshama have a great aliyah in the world of souls. And may our learning today lift him just a tiny bit higher in that world of souls. You're an amazing daughter. Well done. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And we say, with regard to your dad's neshama having a great aliyah and you being showered in blessings, amen. Let's do this. Our daf today is page 94 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 6. This concerns a buyer who is purchasing, for example, grain from a seller. And that grain, so in the ancient world, they didn't have all these kind of high-tech machines that would sift and pick out and ensure that any quantity of grain that was purchased was pure grain. But it was normal in ancient times that there would be some impurities mixed in, whether it was some pebbles and dirt or some legumes, something else. It was normal that a little bit of that would be mixed in with any quantity of produce that was purchased. But if there's too much, then the seller is going to bear some liability. And the question is, how much liability and what's he going to have to do? Is it enough if there's too much of that impurity to sift it, to just get it down to the acceptable level? Or now that he's allowed more than the acceptable level to be included in something that he sold, presumably holding it out as a produce that had the acceptable level when it didn't, is he going to be penalized beyond simply getting that level of impurities down to the acceptable level? Let's see. Rav Huna says, if the buyer comes to sift the produce to check if there is more than the acceptable proportion of impurities, and he finds that there is too much, so then he sifts all of it and returns all the impurities to the seller, not just the amount in excess of the quarter kav per sa of wheat, which amounts to 1/24th, which was, we were told in the Mishna, the acceptable amount. So if it turns out that this produce has more than the acceptable amount, now the buyer has the right to remove all impurities from it, and he's going to be able to charge, and he's going to have to pay only the cost of the regular produce, not this ultra pure produce. Right, so the seller must now provide produce that is free of any impurities. Now, some say that this is a strict halacha, and others say that it is a penalty, right? So now that more than the acceptable amount has been found, now the seller has to provide pure produce with no impurities at all in it. Why? Why isn't it enough to say, no, you just have to reduce it down to what is the acceptable level? Why is it that now that he's been caught, let's say, now maybe he wasn't doing it knowingly, but the fact is the buyer has caught the seller selling something that had more than the acceptable amount of impurity. So now the seller has to deliver absolutely pure produce with no impurities in it at all, at least to the extent that technology allowed that back then. So the question is, why is that the outcome? Why is it? Is it because of just that's what the law requires? Or are the sages imposing a penalty on the seller? Those are the two views. Some say it's just a strict law. Others say it's a penalty imposed by the sages to interpret the law this way. So the Gemara elaborates. Some say that this is simply the strict law. As one who gives money for produce, gives it for good quality produce containing no impurities at all. Even so, where there is just a quarter kav of impurities per sa, a person will not take the trouble to sift the grain and remove the impurities. Instead, he accepts this small quantity of impurities that are present. By contrast, when there is more than a quarter kav per sa, meaning more than the acceptable amount, now a person will take the trouble to sift the grain to remove impurities. And once he takes the trouble to sift the grain, he does not stop sifting until he reduces the proportion of impurities to a quarter kav per sa. Rather, he takes the trouble to sift all of it. So accordingly, once he has sifted out the impurities, he never agrees to accept any quantity of impurities, and so the seller must take back all of the impurities. And some say it's not strict halacha, rather it is a penalty. So the ones who view it this way understand that it is usual for a quarter kav of impurities to be present in each sa of produce, and so it is presumed that a buyer accepts that quantity. More than a quarter kav is unusual, and consequently the seller is suspected of having deceitfully mixed additional impurities into the produce that he sold, so he would make more money. And since the seller deceitfully mixed in impurities, the sages penalized him by requiring him to pay for all of the impurities present, even those which he did not add. And by the way, it might be enough to say that he was negligent, even if he didn't do it intentionally, but he was negligent and allowed the impurity level to go too high because he wasn't careful enough, and so now he's getting penalized. Now, the Gemara presents a siman, a mnemonic, for the cases which are about to follow. And these would be the clues if you were memorizing. It would help you. All two documents of Rav and Bar Rav Nachman, exploitation, contract. Okay, so what is this referring to? The Gemara raises an objection to Rav Huna's ruling from a Mishna in Tractate Kilayim, which is about planting diverse kinds. For example, you cannot plant wheat too close to your vineyard because then there's diverse kinds growing in the same plot. Now, with regard to any sa of seeds that contains a quarter kav of more of seeds of a different kind, before planting such seeds, one must reduce the quantity of the other kind of seeds in the mixture so as not to violate the prohibition against growing a mixture of diverse kinds. See Leviticus 19:19. And the Gemara explains, it can be assumed that the presence of a quarter kav of seeds of a different kind per sa with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds is as problematic as more than a quarter kav is as problematic as more than a quarter kav of impurities per sa with regard to a sale, as discussed here. And therefore, since the Mishnah teaches with regard to diverse kinds only that one must reduce the additional amount, but not that one is required to remove all the seeds of a different kind, it follows that the same is true in the case of a sale. And the seller should not have to take back all of the impurities, and this would contradict Rav Huna's ruling. In other words, it seems like if you're selling someone seeds and there's less than this quarter kav per sa of seeds mixed into it, other kinds of seeds, so this is still permissible for planting. And if you find that there's more than that ratio, what you have to do is, either add more of the correct kind of seed or pick out some of the wrong kind of seed so you get that ratio back under 1 in 24, and then you can plant these seeds. Now that's almost a little bit surprising, right? Because this is a matter of ritual purity. In other words, you can't. This is a hook, right? It's a halacha, a Torah law that you can't plant diverse kinds together. So it's kind of surprising that, well, if it's less than 1 in 24, then you can plant them together. Actually, you can plant them, but then once they start sprouting, you are going to have to go through and remove the ones that are of the wrong kind. But if it's a higher proportion than that, you can't even plant them, because at the time of planting, it's too similar to planting diverse kinds. But the fact is, since it is permissible to just reduce the ratio from unacceptable to acceptable, in the case of planting, why wouldn't we let the seller who had a higher than 1 in 24 proportion of impurities in the grain that he was selling, why don't we just let him get that ratio down under 1 in 24 rather than penalize him and have him remove all the impurity once it was found that he has more than the acceptable amount? So this argues that no, he should be allowed to just reduce it to the correct proportion. Now, the Gemara deflects this challenge and says, no, this assumption is not necessarily correct. Perhaps the presence of a quarter kav of seeds of a different kind per sa with regard to the law of planting diverse kinds is comparable to a quarter kav of impurities per sa with regard to a sale, as discussed here, and both are considered acceptable levels of admixture. So the Gemara asks, well, if it is so that a quarter kav of seeds of a different kind per sa is acceptable, why does the Mishnah teach that one must reduce the quantity of seeds of a different kind? And the Gemara answers, well, the requirement is a rabbinic decree due to the severity of the prohibition of diverse kinds. You can't even be at 1 in 24. You have to be less than that, right? The actual precise condition is not good. You have to be under 1 in 24. Now, the Gemara challenges this answer. Well, if so, and now we're on page 94b, say that the latter clause of the Mishnah, that Rabbi Yosei says it is insufficient to merely reduce the quantity of seeds of a different kind. Rather, one must pick out all the seeds of a different kind. So the Gemara explains why this is a difficulty. Granted, if you say that a quarter kav of seeds of a different kind per sa with regard to the planting of diverse kinds is comparable to more than a quarter kav of impurities per sa with regard to the law of purchase and sale, then it is about this that they disagree. The first Tana holds that we do not penalize one by requiring him to remove that which is permitted due to that which is prohibited, and consequently it is sufficient to merely reduce the quantity of seeds of a different kind to an acceptable level. Whereas Rabbi Yosei holds that we do penalize one by requiring him to remove that which is permitted due to that which is prohibited. But if you say that a quarter kav of seeds of a different kind per sa with regard to diverse kinds is comparable to a quarter kav of impurities per sa with regard to a sale, then why does Rabbi Yosei rule that one must pick out all the seeds of a different kind? And the Gemara answers, there with regard to diverse kinds, this is the reasoning of Rabbi Yosei. One must pick out all the seeds because once he is purifying the admixture of seeds, if he deliberately leaves any quantity of seeds of a different kind mixed in, it appears as though he is intentionally planting and maintaining diverse kinds in his field, right? Which violates a Torah law. So the Gemara suggests, come in here, another challenge to Rav Huna's ruling from a Mishna, tractate Bava Mitzia 37a. In the case of two people who deposited money with one person, and this one of these two people deposited 100 dinars, and the other of the two people deposited 200 dinars. And when they return to collect their deposits, this one says, my deposit was the 200 dinars, and the other one says, no, my deposit was the 200 dinars. Then the Bailey, who doesn't know, and this has to be a factual circumstance where the Bailey was not negligent in not knowing. It's like the two people gave him one bag of money that had 300 dinars in it. And one of them says, yeah, in this bag of money, 200 dinars are mine. The other one says 100 dinars are mine. But then when they come to collect, both of them say, no, I'm the one who had 200 dinars in it. So the Bailey has no way of knowing which one is telling the truth, who gave him what at the outset. They just told him, yeah, one of us has 200, the other one has 100. Here's the bag of money. But now both are claiming that they're the ones who own 200 of the 300. So in that situation, the Bailey gives 100 dinars to this one and 100 dinars to that one, as for sure each of them gets 100 dinars. And the rest of the money, i.e. the third 100, which is contested by these two people, this will be placed in a safe place until Elijah the prophet comes and prophetically determines the truth. In other words, in the Messianic age, hidden questions like this will be answered when Elijah comes. Until then, we have no way of figuring out, because we're not prophets, we don't have access, to the perfect truth in people's hearts. And so what are we going to do? We're just going to put this money away until Elijah comes, and neither one of them is going to get it. So in this case, one of the parties is certainly lying, but nevertheless, the sages did not penalize both parties by placing all of the money in the safe place, right? So one of them is lying, but he's still going to get 100 dinars back, even though perhaps he's lying on purpose to try to get money that's not his. He doesn't lose anything because the one who's lying, he did deposit 100 dinars and he's getting 100 dinars back. So really, what's he being penalized for the lie? It's the other guy who's getting penalized. So similarly, in the case of a sale, where a seller deceitfully mixed additional impurities into the produce that he sold, he should not be penalized and required to take back all of the impurities. He should just be able to adjust the produce until it's back to the acceptable level. But the Gemara rejects this challenge. How can you compare this case of the Beili to our case of the seller of the grain? There, in the case of the deposits with the Beili, it is certain that at least 100 dinars belongs to this master and 100 dinars belongs to that master. Here, in the case of a sale where there is an unacceptable proportion of impurities mixed in, who can say that the seller did not mix in the entire amount of impurities intentionally, just so he can deliver less produce and still collect the same amount of money? So accordingly, no proof can be drawn from the Mishnah. The Gemara suggests, so come in here, a support for Rav Huna's ruling from the latter clause of that Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef says, if so, what did the swindler lose? He lost nothing by claiming the 100 dinars that belongs to another, and he has no incentive to admit the truth. Rather, what we do is that the entire deposit shall be placed in the safe place until Elijah comes. Both of these people are going to lose their deposits. So at least the one who's lying is also losing his, and that would be an incentive not to tell that lie in the first place. Since through his lie, the swindler risks losing even the 100 dinars that he deposited, perhaps that will induce him to admit his deceit. According to Rabbi Yosef, the sages did penalize one who acts deceitfully, which accords with Rav Huna's ruling. Now, that also penalizes the innocent one, but at least we've got a course of action that will motivate the swindler not to swindle. Now, the Gemara rejects this proof. How can you compare these cases? There, in the case of the deposits, there is certainly a swindler, and it is reasonable to penalize both parties in order to induce the swindler to admit his deceit. But here, in the case of a sale, when there is an unacceptable level of impurities mixed in with the produce, who can say that the seller intentionally mixed in anything? Perhaps the impurities were inadvertently mixed in during the processing, and accordingly, no proof can be drawn from the Mishnah, because he didn't do it on purpose. Now, we could say, well, he was negligent, but maybe he wasn't even negligent. Maybe it was an accident, and why should we penalize? Now, the Gemara suggests, come in here, another support for Rav Huna's ruling from a Baraisa. In the case of a promissory note, in which the details of a loan with interest were written, which is illegal, right? A Jew cannot lend money to another Jew with interest. So even before he lends the money, when they write a promissory note to be the instrument by which this loan with interest will be extended, they've already committed a sin, because you can't do that. So what happens? So in a case of a promissory note in which the details of a loan with interest were written, the court penalizes the creditor, and he may collect neither the principal nor the interest. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So according to Rabbi Meir, the sages did penalize one who acts improperly, which accords with Rav Huna's ruling. But the Gemara rejects this proof too. How can you compare these cases? There, in the case of a loan with interest, it is already at the time of the writing of the bill that the lender performed the transgression of placing interest upon the borrower. Since he certainly committed a transgression, it is reasonable that the sages penalized him. But here, in the case of a sale where there is an unacceptable proportion of impurities mixed in with the produce, Who could say that the seller intentionally mixed in anything? Perhaps the impurities were inadvertently mixed in during the processing. Accordingly, we cannot draw a proof from that baraisa and extend it to the law of this purchase and sale with too much impurity mixed in. So the Gemara tries again. Come and hear a challenge to Rav Huna's ruling from the latter clause of the baraisa. But the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir say he may collect the principal, but not the interest. So according to Rabbi Meir, the sages did not penalize one who acts improperly, contrary to Rav Huna's ruling. So the Gemara rejects this challenge. How can these cases be compared? There, in the case of a loan with interest, according to strict halacha, strict Jewish law, it is certainly permitted to collect the principal, so the sages did not penalize him with regard to it. I mean, you're allowed to lend money to another Jew and have the principal returned to you. That is permissible. What you can't do is charge interest. But here, in the case of a sale where there is an unacceptable proportion of impurities mixed in, who can say that the seller did not mix in the entire amount intentionally? Right? Maybe it's not that he just allowed the level to come up over the acceptable level. Maybe he had pure grain and he added a whole bunch of impurities just so that he could save himself a few pounds of the pure grain when he's selling the whole mixture to the buyer, which is definitely an intentional bad behavior which the sages would penalize. But we don't know. We don't know if he did that. We don't know if he did that. We don't know if he did not do that. So it's difficult to draw a parallel with these other cases. The Gemara tries again. Come and hear further support for Rav Huna's ruling, right? That the one who has this too much impurities mixed in, he's going to have to remove all impurities. Come and hear further support for Rav Huna's ruling from that which Rav and Bar Rav Nachman teaches on page 104b. Rav and Bar Rav Nachman's statement is with regard to a situation when land that was sold is later found to be larger than stated at the time of the sale. I'm going to sell you that field. It's an acre. Well, that field turns out to be an acre and a half. Does the buyer get the whole acre and a half or not? If the deviation is not more than an area required to sow a quarter kav of seed per base of land, then the buyer need not return any land to the seller. If it's just a small amount, the buyer gets it. If the proportion of extra land is larger than this, not only must the buyer return the extra land that is beyond the limit of a quarter kav area per besa, but he must also return to him every one of the extra quarter kav areas of land that he received beyond the stated area of a base core. Beyond in other words, it's not enough to return the land to get it back within the margin of error. He has to return all the land back to where it's exactly what they agreed to purchase and sell. So the Gemara infers, apparently, when one is required to return part of a sale because of a discrepancy that is beyond the acceptable limit of deviation, then one is required to return the entire discrepancy, and not just the amount that is beyond the acceptable limit. Seems to speak directly to our case, and this supports Rav Huna's ruling. But the Gemara rejects this. How can you compare these cases? Now on page 95a. There, in the case of the sale of land, the reason the buyer may keep the extra land when it is less than the acceptable limit is that the seller said to him, I am selling you this piece of land, whether it is slightly less or slightly more than a base core, i.e. he agrees to accept a small deviation from the stated area, whether it's bigger or lower, higher or lower. But while an extra quarter kav per besa is not significant, therefore the seller is willing to forego it, more than a quarter kav area per besa is significant, and the seller is not willing to forego any of it. Consequently, all of the extra land must be returned. By contrast, in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the buyer is aware that it is normal to have a certain proportion of impurities mixed in and accepts this possibility from the outset. Accordingly, even if the proportion of impurities is greater than the acceptable limit, it might be sufficient if the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities above the acceptable limit. So the Gemara explains why more than an area required to sow a quarter kav of seed per besa of land is significant in the case of one selling land and it's more than the margin of error of land. The reason is that since all those extra areas of land are fit to combine together to form an area in which one could sow 9 kav of seed, the extra land is a significant plot of land in its own right. and therefore it must all be returned. The land that was sold was stated to be a base core, which is 30 base sa. If the area of the extra land was of a proportion somewhat more than an area required to sow a quarter kav of seed per base sa of land, then 30 such areas would collectively be about equal to an area required to sow 9 kav, meaning the error would amount to the size of a field that could be sold in its own right. Now the Gemara suggests, coming here, a support for Rav Huna's ruling from a Baraisa. The law of price exploitation is that if the disparity is less than 1/6 of the value of the merchandise is acquired immediately and the sum of the exploitation need not be returned. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, then the transaction is nullified. And if the disparity is exactly 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise and the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the entire sum of the exploitation. So now the Gemara explains how this is relevant. Why, in the case where the disparity is precisely 1/6, is the entire sum of the exploitation returned? Instead, let him return only a small amount of the exploitation until the difference is less than 1/6, brings it back to within acceptable margin. So the Gemara concludes, learn from the fact that he must return the entire sum, that when one is required to return part of a sale because of a discrepancy that is beyond the acceptable limit of deviation, one is required to return the entire discrepancy, and not just the amount beyond the acceptable limit. And this supports Rav Huna's ruling. But the Gemara rejects this comparison. How can these cases be compared? There, in the case of exploitation, the seller initially said to the buyer that he would sell the merchandise for a sum equal to its value. Any price difference should be unacceptable. But a disparity of less than 1/6 is not recognizable in a sale worth 100 dinars, and a person will forego it. By contrast, a disparity of 1/6 is considered significant, and a person will not forego it. Consequently, the entire sum of the exploitation must be returned. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, it is a mistaken transaction. The transaction is nullified entirely. By contrast, in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the buyer is aware that it is normal to have a certain proportion of impurities mixed in, and accepted that possibility from the outset. Accordingly, even if the proportion of impurities was greater than the acceptable limit, it might be sufficient that the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities above the acceptable limit. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear support for Rav Huna's ruling from yet another area, this case a Baraisa, when one receives a field from another under a contract to plant trees in it. Then, this field owner accepts upon himself that there may be 10 deficient trees per every 100 trees planted, as he is aware that not every tree planted will necessarily flourish. If the number of deficient trees is more than this, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to replace all of those trees, and not only the number of trees above the acceptable limit. And this supports Rav Huna's ruling. Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, said, there is no proof from this case. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. There is no proof from this case because anytime there are more than this number of deficient trees, the overall area that contains the deficient trees is of a size equivalent to a whole field. Therefore, the contractor is comparable to one who comes to plant the whole field from the outset, who has not fulfilled his remit if he plants only a few trees. Rather, he must plant the entire area. But in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the impurities never constitute an independent unit. Consequently, it might be sufficient if the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities that is above the acceptable limit. Now, that is the law. Rav Huna's ruling is the law, right? If there's more than that acceptable limit of impurities mixed in with the grain, then the seller is going to have to take out all impurities, and that's a strong incentive to not be negligent and certainly not intentional and allow that level of impurities to go up above the acceptable limit. Have we derived how we know that this is so, and why it's and whether it's a strict halacha or a penalty? And that makes a difference, by the way, because if it's a penalty, penalties under Torah law, the way it was practice in ancient Israel, penalties could only be imposed by ordained rabbis, which is not just to say, it's not the same kind of ordination that we have today. Ordination there means that they're qualified judges to issue rulings in the land of Israel, very high level, not just a rabbi. And outside of Israel, they couldn't impose these kinds of penalties. But if it's strict halacha, well then, yes, any Beis Din could impose those kinds of penalties. So that's an important difference. But we really haven't resolved where it stands. We know what the law is. We're not sure how we're deriving that law or how far it's going to be applied outside of Eretz Yisrael. So that's where we will leave off and take some questions. Jonathan, with regard to ratios, maybe one seed is more prolific or creates more seeds itself, or the plants take up more space. I think you're talking about with regard to diverse kinds, where it could really cause a problem. But I think it's interesting. I think, again, it's sort of like they're bending a little bit to reality, that they just couldn't get a bag of seeds that was pure and only going to have one kind of seed in it. So you're allowed to plant it as long as it's under that ratio. And then when you come along and you see the sprouts, you'll be able to see which ones are not the kind that should be there, and you're going to remove them, right? So you're going to have less plants growing in your field. And that's another reason why you need to have that mixture at the outset lower than the 1 in 24. Sharon, we keep talking about the seeds not sprouting. How do we know that proper cultivation practices were not at fault? Proper tilling, water, weeding, etc., regardless of seed quality. Great question. I think that that's definitely going to be taken into account if we get into litigation, because the defendant would be very likely to say, hey, I gave you perfectly good seed. If it didn't sprout on your land, it's because you did something wrong. And then presumably the one seeking to extract the money is going to have to refute that argument and say, I planted my seed according to standard farming practices like everyone does, that I've done for 20 years, and I always got the proper amount of plants coming up. This year it didn't because the seeds were defective. But it would certainly be a point of contention if there was a litigation. Jonathan, what I was thinking, that selling mixed seeds leads to sowing of mixed kinds, and on harvest, these may cause even more mixtures and even higher concentrations. So the problem is causing more and cascading damage. Yes, but that's why they have to go through and remove the sprouts, right? And they're not allowed to maintain kilayim, right? It's not just that you can't benefit from it, you can't plant it, you can't nurture it, you can't make it happen. You gotta ameliorate it, right? You gotta reduce it. And in order to prevent, I think exactly what you're saying. Joe, could it be proven that the seller could have criminal intent if it could be proven that he has exhibited this behavior before, the selling of grain with too much impurity? I would think that that would be a very strong point, a very strong argument if the plaintiff was able to show that with the testimony of witnesses that this guy's done it before. Yeah, that's going to be very strong evidence, and it'll be difficult for the seller to overcome that. And finally, Sharon, did they do any grading of produce? Like it is currently, for example, grade A or extra fine, etc., with different pricing? Great question. I don't know. I'm going to guess, yeah, because I feel like we've definitely seen that there's acceptable limits and there's people who go above and beyond. These were sophisticated people. It's like we see some kind of sword and sandals movie, set in ancient times. Nina and I actually watched Ben-Hur this week, the new Ben-Hur. Very interesting movie, certainly not perfect, problematic in several ways, but quite interesting in its depiction of life, 2,000 years ago. I thought the costumes were especially interesting. And, you see on the one hand, with regard to the Roman buildings, like pretty high level, with regard to kind of rich people living in Jerusalem, pretty high level, kind of doors and hardware. And I'm not saying that the production designers got everything right. Who knows? But I think that, there's things that we can see, and forget 2,000 years ago, even 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, there was quite a bit of sophistication with regard to carpentry and types of buildings and size of buildings, the fineness of clothing. And of course, a lot of this stuff was not available to poor people, for sure. But a lot was, so they were able to do quite a few things, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And I would think that grading and sifting through finer sifters and sort of, charging higher prices for produce that went through more iterations of sifting makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't they do that? Because, there are people who want and can afford the finer produce, and there are other people that can't afford it and are happy to take the cheaper produce. So why not? That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.